Hi, everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of Committee Corner. I'm Stephanie Hamilton, Government Relations and Advocacy Manager for NSPE.
And I'm Margaret Edwards, Policy Associate here at NSPE.
And we're both going to be your hosts for this episode of Committee Corner, where we are going to talk about the appropriations process. Slight caveat, it's going to be a very 40,000-foot view of the appropriations process, because the process is really complicated once you take a deep dive into it. But what we want to do is give an overview, just so that folks have maybe a better understanding of how the appropriations process works.
So first things to know about the appropriations process. These are some terms you might hear thrown around whenever people are talking about the appropriations process. So we just want to, lay them out right now. So the first is authorizations versus appropriations. So authorization bills establish, continue, or modify any federal agency or federal programs within those agencies. The second is appropriations, which provide fundings for those agencies and programs created in authorization bills. And then the second two terms would be the types of spending. There's mandatory spending. And mandatory spending is governed by statutory authority and not set by annual appropriations acts. The second is discretionary spending, and discretionary spending is controlled through annual appropriations process and includes most defense programs and important non-defense investments. So today we're going to be focusing on the appropriations side of things and discretionary spending.
Some key points that we want to note. First, Congress holds the power of the purse when it comes to appropriations, and that power is established in the Constitution. So Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7 says that no money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law. And so that phrase gives Congress the power to decide how money is spent within federal agencies and how much money is spent within federal agencies. It's also important to note that budget requests and appropriations are a key indicator of policy priorities. And not just for the president, though that's what we hear about most often in the media is the president's priorities. But the way that members of Congress talk about appropriations, the way they talk about how they want money to be spent or what departments they want to spend money in, also tells us a lot about the priorities of those specific members. So when we're listening to appropriations hearings, that's something that we're paying attention to is how supportive members of Congress are about certain funding initiatives. So who all is involved in the appropriations process? Well, the president and the executive agencies, of course. Executive agencies include things like the Department of Transportation, Department of Energy, the EPA, and then also appropriations committees within both the House and the Senate. Each chamber has its own appropriations committee, and each of those committees reviews all of the funding requests for all of the executive agencies, and then arrives at final recommendations that then go to the full Senate and the full House to be voted on.
So now we're here to talk about the appropriations timeline. Really important, again, to just remind you guys that this is a very bird's eye view of the appropriations process. So there's more than just these 5 steps, but these are the 5 that we're going to talk about today. Also, that this timeline is what would happen in a perfect world, in which Congress and the president work together each year to pass a budget on time. So the first step of this timeline is the president submits his budget to Congress. By law, this is required on or before the first Monday in February. Oftentimes this doesn't happen. It's a very lenient requirement. This year would be, example of that, with President Biden taking office on January 20th and then having to turn around a budget within just a couple weeks is a very heavy lift. And so once the Congress receives the president's budget, they work on and adopt a budget resolution. The budget resolution is Congress's response to the president's budget. By nature of the resolution being a concurrent resolution, it's an agreement between both the House and the Senate. It never actually goes to the president's desk or becomes law. And this establishes the overall fiscal policy in which to work off of in the subsequent appropriations bills. So the next step is the House and Senate begin work on the 12 appropriations bills. The work begins in the 12 subcommittees within the appropriations committees, and then those bills eventually work their way through the legislative process and are voted on by both houses. So should the bills passed in either chamber have any differences, the appropriations bill or bills will go to a conference committee. The conference committee will then work out the details. And then the conference bill will then go back to both chambers. They'll be voted on. And then if they are both agreed to, they will go to the president for his signature or his veto. So there are three main types of appropriations measures. The first is the regular appropriations measures. These would work through the process that I laid out on the slide before. One key thing is that these appropriations bills must be passed by October 1st, which is the start of the fiscal year. In a lot of cases, each individual bill will be combined into a larger spending package, also called an omnibus spending bill. Instead of voting on 12 individual bills, the House and Senate might only have to vote on, one or two, depending on how they choose to package them together. The next are continuing resolutions. These are placeholders that continue the funding until a budget can be passed. In recent years, we've seen continuing resolutions used in place of a budget to keep the government up and running and avoiding government shutdown. And then the final is supplemental appropriations. These will be passed throughout the fiscal year to provide additional appropriations that will become available then.
So with all that going on, we wanted to just, again, hit some highlights of some of the things that we as the government relations staff at NSPE are going to be paying attention to during the appropriations process. The first one, I'm actually going to hand back to Maggie because I know that she watched this hearing. The House Appropriations Committee had a hearing on the fiscal year 22 budget request for the Department of Transportation.
Yes, so this hearing happened a couple weeks ago in which Secretary Buttigieg appeared before the THUD subcommittee of the House Appropriations Committee and kind of laid out the budget request for the DOT. He mentioned that there's $25.6 billion total in discretionary spending found within the president's budget request that reflect the priorities of the department. Those include first and foremost safety, also equity, addressing climate change, transformational investment, and economic strength. One key thing to highlight here that I'd like to point out would be the dialogue over grants and funding opportunities that the Department of Transportation provides to either state or local governments. This was a question that came from a handful of members of Congress and, showing that that's something that is of value to them and to their constituents.
That's great. Thanks, Maggie. A couple of other hearings that we are also going to be paying attention to. Again, both on the House side, the Appropriations Committee is going to have a hearing for the funding requests for the Department of Energy. And one of the things that we're especially interested in is a request for $6.5 billion for clean energy storage, and transmission projects. There's a lot of opportunity in there for funding projects that are relevant to NSPE members. So we want to pay attention to that and get a sense for how much support there is for that level of funding. And again, on the House side, the Appropriations Committee is going to have a hearing on the Department of Education budget. The president's budget request for the Education Department includes $100 million for increasing diversity in science and engineering programs. And again, that's something that is, that's a policy area that NSPE is interested and invested in. So we want to listen to that hearing and get a sense for whether there's support for that initiative and also for that level of funding. And again, within the Department of Education, there's a budget request for $36.5 billion in Title I grants for historically under-resourced schools in both urban and rural communities. And so there you have it. That is the bird's eye view of the appropriations process. Thanks so much for tuning into this. I know it's a lot to wade into. This episode was a little bit longer than Committee Corner usually is. So thanks for sticking with it. If you have any questions, you're always welcome to reach out to me or Margaret, and we will do our best to answer them.
So you can find the Committee Corner in the NSPE Advocacy Center or on the NSPE YouTube page. So we'll see you next time here in the Committee Corner.
Thanks, everybody.